Welcome to Quirky Cooking Chats. I'm your host, Jo Whitton. I'm so glad you could join me today. I'm going to be chatting today with Dr Pran Yoganathan from the Centre for Gastrointestinal Health in Sydney. Dr Pran is a gastroenterologist and he's really interested in teaching his patients to embark on a journey of self-healing using the philosophy of let food be thy medicine. So this is not very common these days to see a gastroenterologist that is so focused on teaching his patients about nutrition. So I met Dr. Pran recently at a nutrition summit and was really interested in a lot of the things that he had to share. I thought I'd love to get him on the show to pick his brains about meat. It's a controversial topic at the moment, and you may not agree with everything he says, but have a listen, and I really encourage you to be curious and to look into these things for yourself. There's so many great people that I've had on the podcast in the past that have talked about regenerative farming, about gut health, about all different things that are mentioned in this podcast. So scroll down to the notes below and you'll see some other podcasts that can sort of link to these issues and these subjects, and maybe will help you to expand further your knowledge of this subject. Elise Comerford from Wellbelly Health also talks a lot about gut health and nutrition for gut health. So if you are looking for that side of things, have a look at the podcasts below, and I've linked one of her podcasts there. But we have a lot of great information out there that can really help us to make good decisions around meat and animal products, and what to look for, what to use, what not to use in your cooking, and also the whole environmental aspect of meat. If you're interested in regenerative farming and looking after the environment, then I really encourage you to have a listen to this podcast, and also have a listen to the ones that I've linked below. And we will have more on the subject of regenerative farming very soon. Just a reminder that if you are listening to this on a podcast app, you can also watch the videos on my YouTube channel, Quirky Cooking. So if it's a cooking podcast especially, you may want to pop over and watch the video sometime as well. I hope you enjoy this podcast. Welcome, Dr. Pran. It's so good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Jo. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. It's been a long time coming, and I really appreciate you having me on.
No, it was so good to hear you speak recently at the Nutrition Summit down in, where was that? Kingscliff, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
It was a real, it was so good to hear you speak on so many common sense issues. I think a lot of things these days have gone away from the common sense viewpoint of traditional food and way of life. And it's just so good to see, people in the medical profession out there sharing, what real food is, because it seems to be not a common thing so much anymore. Am I right?
Yeah, common sense is not so common, is what you're saying fundamentally, Jo. And I agree with that. I've always kind of gravitated to a root cause type approach to healthcare, I suppose, or to medicine. So, whilst I'm not really into the reductionist model of healthcare where you're reducing a human body down to organ system, I do like to analyze the economic and social and political factors that lead to ill health. So I'm glad you enjoyed the talk. It was kind of a mismatch sort of various topics, but I think to understand disease and human health and the deterioration of human health, we've got to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, there's so many variables. It's not just about the food you eat. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of what you do and how you got into the more natural health side of way of thinking?
Look, I can give you a little bit of background, Jo. So I'm a gastroenterologist and a hepatologist. So we fundamentally specialize in the gut, the human gut and liver and pancreas, so the digestive system fundamentally. It's quite a good specialty that we do as do through internal physician type training. we're a interventional or a procedural specialty. So we diagnose disease by fundamentally looking at it with these cameras. So it's a very objective specialty. So I've always gravitated towards objective healthcare fundamentally. So with my thinking around, natural therapies and so forth, I think you need to go back from that. I think in the healthcare sector, we're always grumbling about how there isn't enough funding and how there's an overwhelming demand and so forth. The reason for that, to me, I've always recognized as being fairly simple. I think the environmental system is kind of just really broken, and our nutrition's really broken. As a result, we've got this huge demand on the healthcare sector. And I've always felt that pouring in money into the healthcare sector is not really the solution. And we should be really looking at preventative healthcare to better the system rather than just trying to plug these gaps, because I think that's a dangerous situation where it essentially becomes an endless void for requirement of funding, especially if we don't address the root cause. So I think that's how I kind of gravitated towards preventative healthcare. When you look at prevention, a lot of prevention tends to focus around movement, sleep, psychological conditioning, and obviously nutrition being the big one there. So I guess that's how I kind of ended up in this space. And nutrition and the gut just ties in so well. It's really interesting. We're not taught much nutrition as gastroenterologists. We're just taught the really basic aspects of it. But the further I've delved into that field, and the more I've gotten to know people like yourself and other people like you in the space, the more I'm convinced that is a critical part of the puzzle that's missing with regards to how we solve this epidemic of disease, of chronic illness.
And do you find that others in your field sometimes downplay the importance of nutrition in healing?
Yeah, well, you've got an agricultural sector and a pharmaceutical sector that kind of work really closely, really, when you think about it. We've got a food system that's broken, a pharmaceutical sector that doesn't really address that. We're always just pumping out medications, and these two industries are so tied in with medical training, and there's so much conflict of interest in medical academia that we fundamentally train a workforce of doctors that don't realize that nutrition's a massive part of the puzzle, so to speak. So how one is conditioned from a very early stage in their career obviously influences the way they practice. And any threat to the establishment is a threat to your ability as a practitioner to be able to put food on the table for your family. Do you know what I mean? And we're such a regulated field that very few people step outside the boundaries of what is perceived to be standard care. We've got a very strong regulatory board, and we just need to look at the case of Dr. Gary Fetke, the orthopedic surgeon who lost his license for many years just for basically telling a diabetic that eating sugar wasn't a great idea. And the patient took that on board, but the threat came from the Dietetics Association. The complaint came from that, and he lost his license for many years. So it's sort of that, well, even if a doctor feels that nutrition plays a role, many of them feel outside their comfort zone in stepping out to talk about that. We're not taught nutrition well. Additionally, if it's a threat to your livelihood, very few people do that. And thirdly, you kind of become stuck in the rut sometimes in healthcare. It just becomes a cycle of disease. You just hand out therapeutics, you think you're doing good by the patient, and on that cycle continues. But, burnout is so common in the healthcare industry amongst doctors and dentists, because I think there is this lack of fulfillment because you never really help fix the patient if you're not dealing with the root cause of why they're getting the disease in the first place. And I think a lot of people get burnt out over time. They don't necessarily recognize it as the cause for their burnout. But imagine just being overwhelmed by disease, which you can never really treat, simply just kind of smooth over and Band-Aid over. And that has to take a mental toll on the person at the other end, which is the doctor,
Yeah, that must be quite depressing to feel like you're just chasing your tail constantly and not getting anywhere.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of them feel that way. Suicidality is really common in our industry.
Really?
Yeah, of course.
Wow.
Yeah, and easy access to drugs means that one can end their own lives relatively quickly. And we've had a number of junior doctors and senior doctors take their lives. And these sort of things aren't talked about openly, that sort of truth isn't necessarily propagated to the general population. But I think the general population needs to know. The more the general population knows, the more they can arm themselves to kind of take on this environment that really is kind of stacked against them.
Mm. If you have a patient who's got gut health issues, so do you have like a dietitian you work with that helps with a more integrative approach? Is that how you work it?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe we can't work in silos, and I believe that no one person can take on the problems of the world. I think we need to build as teams. So I've been able to partner up with a phenomenal academic and practicing dietitian by the name of Jessica Turton. And she, is a very, very accomplished academic, well-published, world-renowned sort of research, especially in that low carbohydrate space and type 2 diabetes, even type 1 diabetes. And she's brought on board her team of dietitians, which she's sort of accumulated over time, which is Ellipse Health. And we've been able to integrate them into our practice. And we just, we kind of take a bit of a holistic approach or a team approach to tackling nutritional issues.
That's amazing. I bet everybody out there who needs a gastroenterologist wants to come see you now. Pardon?
I appreciate that. And it's through people like yourself where I've got these sort of mediums to reach people, that the people are aware of our practice. And now we're living in the era of Zoom and, online and so forth. So we've been doing a lot of that with our dietitians. I mean, I'm still not a massive fan of this sort of telehealth appointments for our patients, because I'm still very cool. I like to meet the person, potentially even physically examine them and kind of do all of that. But we understand that some people can't travel, some people are interstate, so we have catered our practice somewhat to that. Our dietitians do appointments from all over Australia, and so
you kind of have to nowadays, don't you?
You do. So, it's been on that end.
The thing that I really want to focus on today is the effect of meat on the gut health as well as the overall health of the body, and also, even looking at, is the human body supposed to be eating meat, and is it good for us, and what are the issues around that? Because we're hearing so much now about, all the scary stuff on social media and in the news. It's telling us that we shouldn't be eating red meat, that it's bad for us, that it's going to cause cancer. We're getting all sorts of, we're getting such a push to move away from animal protein and animal fats in our diet. And you and I both believe that this is a really important part of the human diet. But I do get questions fairly often from readers saying, why do you use meat in your recipes? Or how much should we be eating? Shouldn't we be reducing it? I'm trying not to eat any red meat, and it's because my father had bowel cancer, all these kind of questions. And I know that people are approaching this with a desire to know about their health and a desire to do the right thing for the planet and for their families and, for our world. But sometimes there is a lot of confusion out there about, there's a lot of false information out there, basically. And I'd love for you to chat about the whole subject of eating meat from your viewpoint as a gastroenterologist, and also because you've researched this so much and you speak so well on it. So I'd love for you to share your thoughts, and I'll just pop in with a question now and then if you want to go for it.
Okay, no problems, Jo. That's fine. Okay, let's kind of really simplify it. Now, scavenging was the first step for us. We became very proficient scavengers of meat. And part of that history we still carry in our gut. We've got this deeply acidic stomach, probably one of the most acidic stomachs that is found in the animal kingdom. And that is a common trait, not amongst carnivores, but amongst scavengers, things like vultures, things like hyenas. So that's where our journey begins. Now, as we went from more of a fruit and fiber-based creature to something that is eating more in the way of animal source proteins and fats, this is what we term foods that are easy for digestion, or more nutrients. There's just more nutrients packed in them. So our gut became more adept at breaking down fats and breaking down proteins, not just reliant on carbohydrates and fiber for sustenance. And over time, these foraging and scavenging behaviors turned to tool making and hunting. Farming took place about 10,000 years ago. We started farming, we started cultivating crop. Prior to that, we were foraging, and I'm sure eating fruits and plants and so forth, but we weren't farming on a large scale. So we went from these really nomadic species of animal or humans, which were following large grazing herds, to being able to settle in one spot, being able to build a civilization. Cities, towns, all that came from agriculture. So during that period, we started developing even more adaptations in our gut, the ability to process milk for once, which is lactase persistence, as we started drinking the milk of animals. Our ability to tolerate carbohydrates went up. So our salivary amylase, pancreatic amylase abilities went up. These are the enzymes that break down sugars. The ability for us to convert fats in plants to medium-chain triglycerides went up. FADS genes, that's the gene that does that, sort of got selected for. So a lot of adaptation started occurring in our DNA, where we were more able to deal with a plant-based life that came with farming. So our dependence on animal-based foods diminished. So what I'm trying to say is that we're not a species that is fixed on a diet. And that's what I hate about some of these ideological arguments around diet, that we should only eat meat or should only eat plants like that. That's not what we are. We've struggled to get to where we are now, and we shouldn't just throw away that history. We got to where we are and grew our brains because of meat and fat, and we became adept at farming, and we became really innovative about how we unlocked nutrients in plants. We learned to soak, ferment, sprout, cook, and we learned how to do something called genetic modification, not in a lab, but essentially through farming techniques, where we started selecting for more nutritious, more tasty, easier to digest fruits and vegetables. So we've gone through all of this history for us to now have an argument about, is meat bad, or was eating vegetables or plant bad? That's it. Really, I find that problematic. So I'd rather that we kind of understand our history. What are we built to eat? And the answer to that, we're built to eat everything, anything, and eating should be about nutrition and nutrients. It shouldn't be about, did I get it from animals or plants? What I know from a very objective perspective is the protein and the nutrients in animal source foods, it's just easier for us to access. In addition to that, the amino acid profile in animal-based foods is very good. So really, that's what it comes down to. Eating is not an ideological process, just the acquisition of nutrients. And we should just kind of look at it from that perspective, not just amino acids, but carbohydrates, fats, minerals, vitamins. That's what it's about.
So when someone feels that, okay, it may be good for you, but it's not good for the planet, and we need to really reduce the amount of meat that we eat, how would you answer that?
Okay. Yeah, sure. And I haven't forgotten your question about bowel cancer either, Joe, and I'll come back.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. That's a difficult argument, Joe, and I think you and me both know people in the farming industry, and most of the farmers think that argument's ludicrous. Perhaps they can't be objective about it because they're farmers, and it's that sort of rhetoric directly impacts their livelihood. But to me, the fact that we can suggest that ruminant animals are the cause of climate change is it blows my mind. There's been
Same.
there's been more ruminant animals that have roamed this planet 1,000 years ago than ever before, right? And so why is it that these animals are contributing to climate change now? There is no doubt that animal agriculture has a long way to go, and I think it could be done so much better. I think that there's a lot of monocropping that goes on for wheat and soy and so forth. These foods are then used to feed poultry and cows, but we know a lot of those animals fed that way are not necessarily healthy. I think you and me both would probably agree that when you've got an animal that is consuming what it's supposed to eat, a cow that's potentially grass-fed and finished, or a goat or lamb, you're going to end up with a healthier animal, and thus healthier food source for the human as well. But to me, it blows my mind that you've got corporate entities such as General Mills and Nestle and Kellogg's and so forth, which must have an enormous carbon footprint, talking about how we should cut out animal agriculture. That to me blows my mind. And the argument that we should bring in fake meats or processed meats made of plant proteins, full of additives and just processed gunk, as something that to replace animal agriculture doesn't make sense, because again, the carbon footprint of these things must be very high. To me, I think it's more about changing the way we eat for corporate gain rather than it is about our health. In addition, when you look at the carbon footprint of the healthcare sector, it's enormous, absolutely enormous. So really, unless we fix our fundamental issue of ill health, which I think can only be done through nutrition and exercise, then we're always going to end up with a large carbon footprint. And I think there's a massive agenda at the moment. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there's a massive agenda to put the blame on farmers when there are far more polluting entities out there. I think messing around with the way farmers do things and their methods of food production can only lead to heartache. And we just need to look at countries like Sri Lanka, which is my home country, where they brought in green agriculture, which is basically getting rid of fertilizer and pesticides and so forth. And what happened? 30% drop in crop yield, and they've got starvation, inability to export, and you've got deaths and people dying and so forth in Sri Lanka of starvation.
Really sad.
It's problematic. I'm not saying that pesticide and fertilizer is the way to go, but we should be transitioning people from that kind of agriculture into a more regenerative, sustainable model long term. I don't think cutting this out suddenly is going to make a difference. So this is what I'd love to see the people in charge do, that we talk about these matters openly and incentivize farmers to embrace a new model of agriculture. And that's what humans have done. We've always been innovative about the way we've done things, and I think it's time to innovate again and change. And I'd love to see that coming from agriculture.
Yeah, I've seen I guess it was a meme going around on social media that really makes it just seems so clear to me. Like, one side is a picture of beautiful green fields with cattle and animals, like a regenerative farm, with the wide variety of animal and plant life and just in their natural habitat. And the second picture is the monocrop sort of farm with people spraying glyphosate, covered in white suits and hoods, and you can't go onto the farm because there's all these signs saying do not enter, poison. And it's like, which one is worse for the environment? It's like, oh, duh.
Yeah.
But for some reason the media seems to get across to everybody that no, the food made from these monocropped farms and the laboratory fake meat and all that is the one you need to be eating for the planet and for your health. And it's like, I guess a lot of people don't understand what's going on in the background, and they're just believing the advertising.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about it this morning. I'm very blessed to live where I do in a country area, and I know I know most of my farmers where I get my different meats, and I know the owner of the trawler where I get my seafood, and I know the people that grow a lot of my produce, and I grow some of my own. And I know that not everyone can do that living in a city. But I think small steps, we can start towards better choices and finding out where food's coming from. And little by little, we can all make a change by what we buy. But yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the revolution kind of begins with the people, really. If you're demanding food from Coles, well, that's what you're going to get. And you've got these large corporate entities that fundamentally put these small grocers and butchers out of business because, well, why? Because that's what the people demand. It's easier just to go and buy your nappies and buy your cleaning products and the meat and all in one same place. But that's we made that, we created that, and I think we as people need to take responsibility for that. Why is that? We live in this environment now, Joe, where everything's about convenience, time, instant gratification, all of this sort of stuff. And really, this is some of the advantages of living in the country. You just got more time. People got more time for you. You're just more in touch with nature, and I think you're less polluted by these gentrified man-made zoos that we find ourselves with in modern civilization. I'm not knocking modern civilization. There's so many benefits to it, but are we really happier? Everyone makes the argument we're living longer, but is that really with quality of life? Are we really living longer with the better lifespans? We've got longer lifespans, but do we really have health spans? So I'd like to see more of a push to people going out into the rural communities. I think I'm not saying you should pick up farming, but if you can even buy a small plot of land and incentivize people to be a little bit self-sufficient, run a few goats, grow their own vegetables, I think their health will improve. And I think over time, people need to start supporting the produce or animal-based foods where it's being done correctly, and over time that's what will occur. But you've got this overwhelming push from a sustainability and climate perspective that meat is at the heart of why we're in this mess today, and that is just slowly conditioning people, and people largely by nature are fairly compliant. So if your messaging is that constantly from dietitians, from doctors, from climate scientists, from public health, well, we're up against it. You know what I mean? And I'll be speaking to Low Carb Australia this October, and this is what I'll talk about. It's all very well to get up there and talk about low carbohydrate or high protein diets or whatever, but really we got to talk about what are the barriers? What are the barriers to access these type of diets? And there's a whole heap of them. And this is why it really, I think a health journey requires a person to really understand what's going on this planet at the moment. And not all of those answers are pretty. Some of those answers are pretty dark. It takes you to a pretty dark place. And people don't want that, Joe. People got hard enough lives and just trying to pay a mortgage, raise kids. And to have this on board, it really it can bring you down. So
confronting.
It can be confronting, but at the same time, I think truth is very powerful, and I think you've got the ability to make some big changes to your life if you can understand the end game.
Just a little example of how you can start to make a difference in your own community. Someone told me the other day, I heard that all cattle in our local area is injected with hormones. And so even if they tell you it's grass-fed, it's still no good for you and you shouldn't eat it, blah, blah, blah. So I went to my local butcher and I said, can I have a chat to you? And I said, look, I'm just wondering, is this true? Is the cattle injected with hormones? He said, my cattle is definitely not injected with hormones. It's just out in the paddock. They eat the grass. We don't even give them any grain throughout their whole life. They're only eating grass. And we had a really good chat. We talked about, additives in things like, preservatives and all of that added to cured meats. He does his traditional cured bacon without any preservatives and nitrates. We talked about all these things and he was willing to stop and have a chat about that. Of course, you've got to find a good butcher who will source those kind of things, but just having that conversation can make them aware that people are interested in these things and do care. And if you never have that conversation, then the people that sell to you think, well, nobody cares, so why should I care about it? And I think it's just important to start having those conversations, to know what's going on and start asking. And even if you live in the city, you can at least, start asking and looking around. There is definitely good places to source meat and vegetables in the city. But yeah, it's just, I think people get a little bit overwhelmed with the whole idea of trying to find all the good things. But if you just start with one food and start working on the best options for that, is that what you would suggest?
I think so, Joe. I think, again, if we really simplify, again, like I'm a big fan of just going back to first principles. You take an animal like a grass-fed, grass-finished cow, you generally end up with a leaner piece of meat. Okay?
Yeah.
Simple. I mean, there's fat there. A lot of that fat contains a hell of a lot of nutrients like vitamin A and a whole lot of minerals and healthy fats in there, omega-3s. And you take an animal like a deer that's out foraging in the wild, you get a lean piece of meat. Kangaroo, lean piece of meat. Pork, wild pork, lean piece of meat. But we human beings, we desire more than that, right? Something with a higher fat content to us is more palatable. So when you get people paying $200 for a little bit of Kobe beef or something like that, which is heavily grain-fed. This animal is fundamentally an obese animal, right?
Yep.
And being bred that way through us grain feeding and giving it energy, you reduce the protein content in that piece of steak and you up the fat content. So again, it comes back down to consumer. You tell people to have grass-fed finished beef and they say, oh, well, that's too lean for me, or oh, that's chewy. Yeah, it's a bit chewy, or it's too gamey for me, or something like this. And again, it has to come down to consumer choice. This is why I'm a big fan of educating people on that, because you've got to be responsible for your decisions. It's all very well to blame big food and big pharma and big government and so forth, but you've got to be understanding what's going on to your system. So grass-fed finished beef, which is not dependent on any grain, probably has a very low carbon footprint because there's no monocrop required to run that animal. In addition, we know that cattle are great sequesters of carbon. I'm not an expert on this, so I won't go into it, but we know a lot of these regeneratively run farms with animals that are just grazing, and rotational grazing in particular tends to sequester carbon. So you've got an environmental solution there. So we should be supporting products like that. But you just look at what people desire. I mean, you go into any restaurant, the grass-fed option would probably be the least ordered option because it's just leaner and potentially more chewier. But that is what we should be supporting. People need to take some responsibility for that. We know when you grain feed an animal, and if you excessively grain feed a cow, you can potentially kill it. It's called grain overload. The omega profiles in the fat changes with more omega-6 and less omega-3. In addition, you get more of a fat content to the animal. I'm not saying animal fat is bad, but I'm saying protein is the key, and that's what we should be looking at. In addition, an animal fed what it's supposed to eat generally does better. Yeah.
So what can you tell us about the whole red meat causes cancer idea?
Yeah, no, that's a very common thing. So 2015, the World Health Organization sits down, panel of 22. A lot of them have written for plant-based type advocacy. I think that 14 of them were pro-plant-based, and they decided red meat causes cancer. Now, they went in with a bit of an agenda, and I think they came out of it with the result that they wanted. So 22 of that panel, 14 had very pro-plant-based views. They started off by trying to prove that processed meat causes cancer, and they came up with an increase in odds ratio of 1.18. Okay, they said eating processed meat every day increases your risk of bowel cancer over your lifetime by 1.18. That's your absolute risk. Now, when you convert it to something called relative risk compared to those that don't eat that processed meat every day, their risk is 1. The group that eats the processed red meat every day is 1.18. The relative risk is 1.18 equals 18%. So the relative risk is 18%. You tell someone that their risk goes up 18%, they go, oh, well, that's pretty significant. But let's look at it from a very simplistic perspective. They looked at people that ate processed meat every day, and you look at that sort of population, these are people that are eating a lot of things like burgers accompanied with fries and, you know, milkshakes and pizzas and so forth. These are people not leading good, healthy lifestyles where they're focusing on whole foods. These are people probably consuming very processed food heavy diets. So immediately you've got a bias, okay? So, but you take that out of the equation, somehow in 2015 in that same panel, they decided that red meat probably does it too. So processed meat increases it by 1.18, and they classify that a group 1A carcinogen, which means it probably causes cancer. And they did a hit job on non-processed red meat, even though that wasn't their intention. They went in looking at processed meat. They came out with the conclusion that red meat, unprocessed, like your whole food red meat, was probably a carcinogen as well. They classified that group 2A. So
that wasn't even part of the study, but
no,
they just
that wasn't
lumped it
part
in
of the
there.
intention. They just that conclusion. So that 1.18 is not included for whole food red meat, but the processed meats and red meats, non-processed, are lumped together by bodies like the Cancer Council and propagated to the population. We're trying to do meat-free Mondays. What does that mean? You know, there's a big difference between eating a meat lover's pizza and sitting down to a grass-fed finished steak. And the crazy thing to me, Joe, is the same people that will tell you that they're worried about eating meat would have no qualms to sit down and eat a couple of bowls of processed pasta, you know, and having, you know,
breakfast cereal for dinner. That's
right. And a bowl of ice cream for dinner and some Tim Tams while they're watching Netflix. You know, it really blows the mind. And I'd like to see that all revisited. I'd like to see more objective evidence looked at. Even on the 2015 panel, they looked at 800 epidemiological studies. Epidemiology is the lowest quality evidence. They did not look at randomized control trials or systematic reviews. They looked at 800 studies. Of those 800 studies, 780 showed no association. So they had to sit down and analyze 20 epidemiological studies to come to that increase in risk of 1.18. And then they put on red meat. Okay, so I know this data very well. And as a gastroenterologist, I'm flabbergasted by the public health policy on this. You know, questioning public health for a doctor is a death wish, you know, because our regulator, the APRA, can come down on this. But I challenge us to as a population to really question where this data is coming from, and is to have whole food red meat lumped in the same group as Roundup as probable carcinogens or cancer causing is a problem. The World Health Organization is comparing or putting red meat, unprocessed red meat, in the same category as Roundup and saying these are probably cancer causing, group 2A. That's probably
with absolutely no evidence.
Well, just really weak circumstantial evidence that is not statistically sound. So let me put it this way to you, Joe. If you're a heavy smoker, your lifetime risk of lung cancer is 25 times, okay? 2,500% higher than someone who's a non-smoker. If you're a heavy processed red meat eater, your risk is 18% higher than someone who's a non-processed red meat eater.
Right. That does put it into perspective, doesn't it?
2,500% versus 18%. And I'm not saying processed meat's great. I think processed meat should be really low down in your tier of foods, because I'm not a big fan of processed meat, but to lump in well-raised animals using good quality meat in the same category as processed meat is highly problematic, and I think extremely flawed, and I think is really poor quality science.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good to know. Thank you. There's also the sort of idea that any animal fats are no good for you. And you did mention, that lean meat is great, but animal fats are also good as in their natural form. Can you say anything about that sort of idea with fats being vilified these days?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very simple. You take a grass-fed finished animal, look at the fat color in a grass-fed finished animal. You'll generally have an orange tinge to the fat. That's the vitamin A precursor. So the fat is a matrix that's containing nutrients. Fat is also an energy substrate. We can utilize it as energy. Fat is also something that is a building block. Cholesterol can be a building block for things like hormones and so forth. I think the focus has to be on protein, because that's kind of our major building block. The amino acids are a major building block. And in sedentary populations, which we all are, Joe, we're not as active as we used to 50 years ago, or even in the pre-industrial revolution. So we've got to really take that into account, that we would, we're not moving as much as we should. So perhaps fat is something that we should judiciously use. I've always said, for someone trying to lose weight, there's no prices for overeating fat, right? It really the focus has to be on protein, lower fats, and potentially lower carbohydrates. Generally, the advantage of animal-based foods is if you're consuming a high-protein diet, generally that protein matrix will bring with it its fats and its cholesterols and so forth. And I think we should be aiming for that type of model.
Yeah, that's very sensible. One last question, the glyphosate question. So we've seen a lot lately with studies showing that glyphosate's in our urine, it's in our food systems, it's in pretty much everything now. But they're still not quite getting rid of it. I hope they do. Can you just give us a little, I know when you were at the Nutrition Summit, you talked a bit about the whole glyphosate issue. So I'd love some input on this subject as well.
Sure. I mean, glyphosate is probably going to be detectable in most of our urine now, most of Australia's urine. I'm pretty certain if you're extrapolating data from Europe and America.
Yeah.
Why is that an issue? I mean, the Australian government website says it's not an issue. However, glyphosate is a known antibiotic. We know that it has an adverse effect on the bacteria and possibly the fungi within our soil. Now, why is that relevant to us? We know that bacteria and fungi in soil are important, in terms of making sure that the plant is healthy. So if glyphosate is being administered in a high level, I think we destroy the microbiome within our soil. But then you think about it, if it's destroying the microbiome in our soil, what does it do to the microbiome within our gut, the trillions of microbiome that exist within our gut? Preliminary data starting to show that about 60% of our gut microbiome is sensitive to glyphosate. About 40% is resistant, 60% is sensitive. And all of this is a balance. So if you're continually consuming foods rich in glyphosate and it's totally detectable in you all the time, and then you're going to start over time having an effect on the gut microbiome. And as you're killing off some of these beneficial species, you get an overgrowth of species that are resistant. Does that make sense? So you lose that beautiful equilibrium that exists in your gut. And I think that over time leads to disease. We know that the gut microbiome is important. We don't quite understand how it links to disease, but we think the alteration in the gut microbiome leads to probable dysbiosis, which leads to intestinal permeability, reduction in mucus production, reduced ability to break down fibers, because we need a healthy microbiome to be able to break down plant fibers. This is no wonder to me that a lot of people struggle with plant fibers now. And the blanket rule is that, well, fibers are bad for you. Well, that's not the case. As a human being, you must have the ability to break down fiber, right? And it's beneficial for us to break down fiber because we extract a beautiful ketone out of that, which is a fuel for our brain and heart and lungs, and so brain, heart, and liver, and so forth. But a lot of people have lost that ability. Why is that? I think the microbiome is completely under threat. And I think glyphosate is a big player in this. And I think we need more research. I think we need to understand the role it plays. But glyphosate is owned by a drug company. Bayer own that. And for Bayer, it's been a very profitable acquisition from them as they bought it from Monsanto. And the data around glyphosate is often very quickly shut down and said that, well, it's safe to utilize, but because glyphosate blocks something called the Shikimate pathway, and the argument is that humans don't have that Shikimate pathway in our cells. That's true, but as I said, 60% of our gut microbiome does. What are we doing to our gut microbiome? That's the question. You got people eating these foods soaked in glyphosate and then consuming probiotics and prebiotics to say, well, we're doing good by our gut. That's kind of I think that is that's problematic. I don't think it quite works that way.
Yeah. So if the cattle that we're eating are eating grass that's been sprayed with glyphosate, will we get that through the meat?
Yeah, really interesting question, Joe. Yeah, but my preliminary analysis is that no, glyphosate doesn't accumulate in animal-based foods, and I think that's one big win.
That's good to know.
Yeah, that's one big win for us. Animals seem to, like us, urinate it out. I don't think there's any evidence that we accumulate it in our tissues per se. As I said, it has an effect on our gut microbiome, but a lot of it we are excreting in our urine. And I think the animals do the same. Does it affect the gut microbiome of the animal? Maybe that this animal comes out less healthy. In addition, if it's grazing in glyphosate-soaked pastures and plantlands, I think there's just less nutrients in the plants because we know glyphosate chelates and holds on to a lot of the nutrients in the soil, as we discussed earlier, that it destroys the microbiome, which means that you just get a less nutritious plant. Animal eating a less nutritious plant means that the tissue sequesters less nutrients. It's just a cycle of loss of nutrients, really. So I think if you can find animals that are in pastures that are not treated with glyphosate, I think we just end up with a healthier animal.
Yeah. So to sort of wrap it up a little, would you say for those who are worried about eating meat that is not perfect, like it may not be certified organic, would you say it's still better to have some meat that's not certified organic than to have none at all?
Absolutely. I think meat is a critical part of our diet. It's something that we culturally enjoy, we value it. Is it possible to get all your amino acids through the plant-based way? Yes, especially if you're eating plants that are in nutrient-rich soils that are not treated with these pesticides. As we know, a lot of these plants and grains and fruits are now. They're treated very heavily, which is an issue. But you say you theoretically wanted to achieve this through plants. Yes, absolutely. But you just need to be smarter about it. You need to combine various plant sources to make sure that you're getting the essential amino acid profile. We also know a lot of plants carry anti-nutrients, which means that you don't absorb everything that you're eating. Additionally, we know that you have to increase your calorie intake to be able to consume the same amount of nutrients as you do from plant food. So obviously you end up overeating energy sometimes in those cases. Plant food is not necessarily as palatable as animal-based foods for a lot of people. So you've got to add in these additives that are sources and high in carbohydrate and high in fat. So you just end up with this issue where you're just overdoing energy. I think it makes sense to eat animal-based foods because it's not just about amino acids. It's about B12, it's about iron, it's about choline, it's about a whole heap of nutrients that are found in these things. And I think vast majority of the world are starved of animal protein, and you just need to look at places like India and Africa to know that these sort of places don't do well in terms of health. Their diabetes presentations are extremely dramatic and at an earlier stage, and mortality and morbidity from type 2 diabetes in places like India, which is a very heavily plant-based nation, is very high. So plant-based eating is a good way to do it. You've got to question why is India's health so poor. So I think people just need to be sensible about it. And I think we as human beings, we're definitely designed and evolved to consume meat. It's just about, well, where is it coming from? We're definitely built to consume plants and fruits and tubers and grains. Even the grains, we can consume it because we can use things like grinding and pounding and so forth to access the energy in it. It's just about making sure that it's not subject to this chemical-based agriculture that we find ourselves in. Additionally, we've got things like food out of season where foods are being flown in from different countries, and that's not great. So I think we've just got to really take it back to very simple principles, which is seasonal eating, what is available to me now, make it as unprocessed as possible. And remember, it is not about being plant-based or being animal-based. It's just about nutrients. At the end of the day, as long as we can hit those nutrient targets, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, our fats, I think we're going to do well.
Yeah. Having a balance, wide variety, keeping the microbiome healthy, and at the same time, you can actually be helping the planet and not need to, if you're getting your food from farming practices that are helping the planet, like agriculture that is regenerative, you can really rest assured that you're doing the right thing for your body and for the planet.
Absolutely, Joe. And look, I'd just like to remind everyone that this theory that our planet's ending is not a new thing. This has been a recurring theme through Aristotle and Plato's Rome, through Thomas Malthus 200 years ago, Paul Ehrlich 50 years ago, and now we've got the same now, where people have been predicting the doom of the planet. The planet will be fine, and the planet will be there well after we're gone from it. And I think it's just really, for us, we have to just become very objective, very focused on what needs to happen. And I think question some of the narratives that are going on, because you've fundamentally got people that are the ruling class making decisions for you. Really, you're losing your autonomy there. But so it's really on you to educate yourselves and make good decisions.
Do your research. Get out there and read and ask questions. Be curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But you know, a lot of this stuff is confrontational for people. I mean, I put out a lot of content around it. You know, and I just noticed just on my, not that I track profiles, but I lose followers by the thousands every month because I suspect, one, I'm incessant about my postings, I get that, but it's very confrontational for people they'd rather just see a video clip that's easy to digest or something like this, rather than digest content that you have to think about, critically analyze, and then potentially feel a little bit, a bit uncomfortable about. I think we've lost that ability to be resilient, and that to me is problematic. Yeah,
good point. Well, thank you so much for making us think today, because we all need that. So what's your website again?
It's centreforgastrointestinalhealth.com.au. But yeah,
I'll put the link.
I'm sort of active across quite a number of platforms, including Twitter and Facebook and stuff. So let's see how it all goes, Joe.
Yep. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks again.